Thanks everyone for joining us. First and foremost, and second of all, a big thanks to Sherry for joining us today. So in this particular webinar, as many of you who would have joined us before, we sort of cover different topics, talk to different people, but I'm really grateful that Sherry agreed to spend a bit of time with us and talk about primarily the advent of AI and particularly how that's going to impact the role of the CFO. And it's come at an interesting time in terms of what you're doing in your life. So we'll talk a bit about that. Before I get into all of that, of course, we are streaming this live. We will record it. So for those of you who have colleagues that you'd like to share it with, it will be made available by tomorrow. So we'll let you know about that. The other thing is that we do have a Q&A function. So the Zoom, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Zoom by now, the Q&A function. Feel free to put questions to Sherry as we go along, and we've made time at the end to really cover those really towards the end, but perhaps we'll pick up some of these during the conversation. So just by ways of introduction, Sherry, to those of you who don't know, in fact, just finished up 10 months ago as the CEO of Newcrest Mining, which was Australia's largest gold miner. And that was in December. For those of you who would have followed it, it was acquired by Newmont, which I think is sort of the largest takeover in that space, $26 billion, not a small transaction, making it or joining it into the largest gold mining company in the world. Prior to that, Sherry was the CFO since February 22, and before that, the CFO of Woodside Energy, based out of Perth, for more than 4 years. So really lots of really great experience for us to leverage off. She's had three decades of experience across global energy and resource companies, including Newcrest, Woodside, as we mentioned, Royal Dutch Shell, ExxonMobil, Duke Energy, and J.M. Huber. She holds a Bachelor of Science Accounting from Louisiana State University and an MBA from the University of South Carolina. She's lived and worked in pretty much every corner of the planet, I think. North America, Latin America, Europe, Middle East, and of course, now in Australia for the last few years, since 2017. And we captured a really critical juncture in her career because she's about to start as CFO of Santos. Is it Monday? Monday she starts after 10 months, a bit of a hiatus. So Sherry, a big thanks for joining us and really appreciate your time there. So yeah, maybe just before we get into the matter of AI and sort of how it might be impacting the world of the CFO, maybe just let us know sort of what you've been up to since you stepped down, and maybe a bit of a glimpse of what you're kind of expecting stepping back into the role at Santos.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks again for having me today. I think I mentioned to you when you called me about this, it would be a great chance for me to get out of my Lululemons and stained t-shirts and Ugg boots and get ready to go back into the office. But I've had a great 10 months off. It's actually the first time in my 30-year career that I had any time off other than maternity leave for my 2 children, which is any parent will know is not leave, that's hard labor.
It's worse.
And you know, of course, I did the taking care of myself, spending time with family and friends, spending more time with my kids, which was wonderful. But I also took that opportunity to really think about my leadership, reflect back on my career, not only during the time of being a CFO and briefly a CEO, but also just being able to work around the planet and in the industry that I'm now going back into in oil and gas. And of course, that very quickly led me to do a lot of reading and a lot of interchanges with folks around technology and around, you know, artificial intelligence specifically. And it is something that, you know, to give you a little peek in my new role, technology does report to me. So it's not just in the sense of the CFO role, but I think those listening would probably recognize that more and more technology is a function that if it doesn't sit in the CFO role, it's something that the CFO has to partner very closely with. Because it's something that not only benefits the finance organization, but ultimately the entire enterprise. So that's what I've been up to over the 10 months, a little bit of binge watching of, you know, Netflix and Apple TV as well, probably too much of that. And now I'm very excited to get back into it from next Monday. So definitely a great time to be talking to you today.
Yeah, no, very exciting. And I suppose just in terms of the world and where things are moving, AI and everything else, it is a very exciting time to be taking on a challenge like that. So what would you have seen sort of change I mean, you stepped into Australia in 2017 as a CFO, initially at Woodside and then Newcrest. How have you seen things sort of changing in the time?
Yeah, and it's funny because it makes me feel old talking about that. I just turned 50 2 weeks ago, which according to my children means that I'm ancient, but I'm going to say 50 is the new 30. But you know, when I reflect back to 2017, you know, it feels in one way like it was yesterday, but when I think about the world that the CFO was facing, it's actually changed fundamentally, and I think will probably continue to change, maybe even at an accelerating pace as we move forward. You know, when I stepped into Woodside in 2017, and it was probably also the case in Shell, you know, one of the biggest challenges that I saw, which was also an opportunity, was just convincing finance people to get out of Excel. Yes. And I remember, you know, coming into Woodside and actually terrorizing some of the folks in my team by saying that we were going to find a way to make Excel obsolete. And I had people coming to intervene with me to let me know that it was a crazy idea and the whole company would stop functioning if we got out of Excel. Now, I hope that as we're sitting here today in 2024, people have realized, or maybe have already escaped Excel and have realized that, you know, we've got multiple things coming out, feels like almost by the month sometimes, that can, you know, be a lot more accurate, a lot more high power, and actually allow us to, you know, be analytical folks as opposed to, you know, transactional folks. But, you know, what else has happened since 2017? You know, if I think about the world from an energy space that I work in, you know, the two biggest risks actually that we see today are cybersecurity and climate change. And when you think about the biggest opportunities to address that, well, technology, you know, the war on technology is going to be the way to actually not only develop new business models and new technologies to produce clean energy, but also to support the whole organization and how we do our work. And so it's fundamentally changing everything. Of course, you know, COVID got in the middle of that. We now have geopolitical upset that, you know, probably an order of magnitude that we haven't seen in a long time, which is very worrying, but all roads lead back to technology and ultimately to, you know, AI as a key component of that when you think about where we're going from here. Maybe last point on that, where we really get into the meat of it, is I had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to go to New York City while I was there in the US visiting family. And some of you might know there's a climate week that's been taking place in New York City for a few years now. And it really brings people together from financial institutions, of course, from all of the big energy companies, the big mining companies, but also a whole plethora of startups and, you know, the big guys like Google, Amazon, et cetera. And one of the things I learned in that forum that I hadn't been quite aware of is that the biggest concern that the big AI, let's say, generators or, you know, source producers have is how are they going to get the energy to support their data centers. That is an overwhelming amount of growth that's occurring to get the data centers to generate the AI that customers are demanding, and that needs energy as well. So that was a big pickup that I took in terms of kind of thinking about the complexity of the energy system, even as it relates to supporting the generation of AI itself.
I mean, I was reading, I think initially with the rise of crypto, people are worried about the energy impacts that would have on mining and the like, but what we've seen now with the rise of AI and obviously the processing power required for that, you're right. It's interesting how it's got these impacts far beyond just the availability of these tools and, you know, techniques that people could utilize in their work lives. So what we actually thought we would do is maybe just to encourage a bit of participation. I thought I'd kick off with a bit of a poll just to get people's view on sort of how they are perceiving AI in their own worlds, and then we'll start talking a bit about what that means. So hopefully you guys can see that now. I'll actually to see it. So really looking to understand what opportunities you see for AI in your organization. Hoping you guys can just vote on all of those. You can choose as many as you can pick there, but really looking at a number of areas from improved compliance and cost competitiveness, automation, which really feeds into that, upskilling of employees, risk management and fraud detection. That's obviously something that's near and dear to our hearts at Satori, and predictive capability. I had to put the one at the bottom, which don't see any benefits for AI, but hey, there will be detractors out there, so we'll let that run.
So far it's 0. I was going to say, who wants to debate me after my opening comments?
Maybe that's what's scaring them off it. I'll give it a couple of seconds, let you all sort of cast your vote, and then we'll look at the results, and I can actually then share it. All right, I'll close it now. Apologies if anybody hasn't been able to see that. So hopefully you can see the results in front of you. Automation seems to certainly be the biggest one. It's interesting that it's quite spread amongst the others, from predictive capability, and certainly an area that we're quite interested in, fraud detection and risk management, upskilling, cost competitiveness. So maybe with that in mind, and I know these are some of the topics that you were thinking about in advance of this, what are the opportunities that you're seeing, and how well does that sort of align with what you're perceiving? Feel free to disagree.
Yes, exactly.
With the audience.
And I think, as you've kind of implied, it is a bit of a trick question, because Mark and I did, for the audience's benefit, we did come up with this list together.
Yes, exactly.
And, look, maybe just a couple of observations, and you may want to pick a couple of those for me to give some examples of, because, we talked before this that I've probably got multiple examples on each one. When I was looking at the poll, what struck me, and I do think things are changing, and I hope it's something that the audience members will take away today, is that when I think about the opportunities for AI, and I think about this more broadly from a leadership perspective, it all comes back to people. Because where value is created in companies, certainly in my sector, and I'd argue in every sector, is skill set, the capability, and of course the underlying business ethics and integrity of the organization. So when I think about how to motivate and inspire people to get the best out of AI or any portion of technology, it is starting with the continuous upskilling of people, which is also fundamentally around cultural change. And I kind of gave that, what I used to think was a silly example, but it is actually a profound one around, people being terrified to come out of Excel. I think there's been such a fear about technology for so long, particularly in the finance space, that it's going to take away all our jobs.
Yes.
And it's going to make our skill sets obsolete. And I actually see it in the opposite way. I think it's going to allow us to continuously upgrade our skills as employees. It probably changes the whole nature of work, makes it much less tedious, much more interesting, much more, allowing finance people to be true business partners that I think we should be, and enabling decision support. So what I'd like to see in those sorts of polls going forward is that people start with the human element and then back into, which wasn't on the poll. What is the business strategy that we're trying to achieve? And what are the key problems in our business that we can tackle using AI, as opposed to trying to make it fit into a bucket just because somebody else may be doing that? And in that sense, every company is different. And even within the same company, there may be different things in the life cycle of that company where it's more or less useful. One key example around, automation, but it's also about better decision making, for me, goes back to mining and, being able to actually model complex reservoirs, whether it be oil and gas, whether it be, gold and copper. It used to be that it would take many, many engineers and, support people months, if not years, to model a reservoir. And then the accuracy of that, as anybody working in the sector would know, would be very low and perhaps never very high. And now, with the support of some of these big, organizations like Google, like Amazon, which does take a lot of data center capability, et cetera, you can model the same reservoir with much higher accuracy once you look at go forward performance and kind of benchmark how did it predict in days and in sometimes hours. And then but what you do find when you look at those organizations is the number of engineers did not go down as a result of that predictive capability. They're actually just able to do a lot more and spend a lot more time making better decisions around the data in terms of field development plans, et cetera.
And potentially looking at scenarios that maybe weren't considered, or, the whole machine learning ability of being able to sort of learn from feedback that it gets to improve the results going forward again. Something that is humans, we're not always that good at doing. We often sort of stick to doing things the way we've always known them to do. And of course, AI can do that just by virtue of how it functions.
And I think what I would add, and it's a very broad one, because again, I think it touches on all of these areas of the polls. One of the things that's always frustrated me the most, but in behalf of my people, is having people come in a room to present a key decision or to present, business plans or forecast. And you can just tell immediately from the first question you ask that they spent all their time, working a spreadsheet and then probably copying and pasting it into a PowerPoint. They know the numbers tick and tie, but the moment that you scratch beneath the surface, they can't answer the questions. And it's not because they're not smart, capable people. It's because they've had to spend all their time doing this manual stuff, when in fact the technology could have done that, and they could have spent the time stepping back, thinking like an owner, which is what I think we all need to be doing as finance and business people, and saying, what's this data telling us? And again, how does it link back to our strategy, our business purpose, our objectives, et cetera? And those are really fun types of work to do. And, it'd be a much more fun and productive conversation as well. So that again gets back to the people and the continuous upskilling.
Yeah. But I see also a danger with that in that, I mean, take ChatGPT. So I think most people associate now AI, the rise of AI, particularly with ChatGPT, which frankly has been, I think, caught everyone by surprise in terms of how quickly it's evolved and so in all of our lives. But I think what it's done is, you're right, I think for some people who've taken it on properly have been able to use it as a way of getting better results, fine-tuning whatever it is they're doing, and just upskilling as a result. But others have sort of just passed the buck to it and said, okay, I don't know anything about this area, write me up whatever I need to know, and just presenting it as their own. And I know we're talking about even school kids doing that, and my kids at university. But how do you see that sort of impacting things?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, I'm writing myself a note. I probably need to start using ChatGPT because I've noticed that everyone uses it now, and I haven't been using it. Maybe I'm behind, but I think, and I hope we touch on this from a few different angles, Mark, because a lot of I'm really into philosophy as well. And I think, any modern philosopher is actually talking disproportionately these days around the growing use of artificial intelligence and, deep fakes and, the singularity, if you like, where the computers become smarter than the humans and, extinguish us all because they decide we're bad for the planet. Now, I'm not as much of a, nihilist of that as to think that we're all going to, perish by 2040. But I do think there's a huge, huge assumption and principle that has to be adhered to when you use AI, is that AI is a tool to help you. AI is not the author. And AI should never be used, even just from a practicality perspective, much less from a moral and ethical perspective, to replace human thought and human accountability. And, it kind of goes back to pre-technology, what is a good finance person? A good finance person to me is not someone who can add up the numbers. Yes, you need to be able to add up the numbers, and they need to be able to reconcile, and it should follow, accounting principles and all that. But then you have to step back and say, well, what does that mean? And if those numbers changed, why did they change? And, if I can't explain it, I need to go find out. And if I still can't explain it, there might be an error. And so none of that accountability should ever be relinquished as we use AI. And, to your point, I was speaking with my 16-year-old niece, and she got in pretty serious trouble at school because her teacher accused her of cheating on an essay with ChatGPT. Now, it's a gray area, right? Because students these days, any of you who are parents will know, aren't allowed to use ChatGPT. But not to just press a button and let some wonky paper be written. And the reality is the algorithm is not sophisticated enough. Any one of you who've used it will know it. Some real weird stuff can come out sometimes. So it doesn't relieve your accountability to edit and to own what goes in there. And so I think kind of coming back to that and then linking that to the upskilling is where it still becomes humans utilizing technology, not technology running away from and trampling over humans.
And maybe that's the challenge for us going forward, is kind of demystifying it for people to understand what are the areas that can really add value. And of course, but it's still your work, you're still accountable for it. You can't pass the buck to it, but at the same time, what are the areas that you have to, as a human, kind of step in and own and present and work with, even if you've been assisted by these technologies. And I think you're quite right. We're not quite at a stage where people can quite split those things in their minds. It's either let it do all the work for me, or I'm going to do it without it. And there's probably a happy medium that we'll hopefully land on that front.
I would hope so. And I think that, for me, what I'll be taking into my new job, and again, as a broader leadership reflection, is to say, as a finance person in a complex, multi-billion-dollar organization, what really are the questions that we're trying to answer? What really are the things that we need to track in the business? Not everything that you can track, not every interesting bit of data that often engineers and finance people love to see, but what is it really that turns the dial? What really will cause you to make different decisions or to behave in a different way in the organization? And that usually is a very small subset
Yes.
of the total data that you have available to you. And then once you've gotten to that, what's the right questions to be asking, then you can apply the AI in a very focused way,
Yeah.
but you're still owning it because it's still answering your
Yeah.
questions. And you
Yeah.
still have to then interrogate that data and say, is that logical? And
Yeah.
and then, produce business decisions with it. So again, it's an enabler. It's not, it shouldn't be running you.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned sort of some of the the risks and the downsides of it. So of course we don't need to necessarily talk about the catastrophic risk of it sort of eliminating humanity in that, but there are risks inherent even in AI as it stands today. And how do you balance that with sort of the kind of gains that we spoke about earlier?
Yeah.
In the world?
Yeah, I think I've touched on it a bit, but I think a funny one that I wanted to share is that, when you think about AI, one of the biggest concerns that people have, I mentioned cybersecurity, and that absolutely is increasingly becoming something that boards are very concerned with, as they should be, and therefore CFOs and leadership teams are very focused on making sure that, you try to constantly keep up with the change of technology, because that's the only way to keep yourself secure. But there's also this, this idea of deep fakes that is out there that can totally, impact companies from a reputation perspective, et cetera. One that I think is kind of humorous, some of you might have noticed. I am a huge Taylor Swift fan, and I think there are billions of us out there, so I'm sure there's some on the call, regardless of gender. I don't think it's just a girl thing who love Tay-Tay. But someone had the audacity to deep fake Tay-Tay that she had endorsed Donald Trump, who I also do not support. And it caused her to have to come out and correct the deep fake. And it's a bit of a humorous one, but when you think about the ramifications of AI being able to basically hijack, for example, this webinar, and then you and I could say all kinds of bizarre things, and then it could be broadcast out to people and they would think that it was us. And that, that can go anywhere from terrifying, humorous to terrifying. I do think you have to be very, very sophisticated as a company in terms of the firewalls that you put up around yourself externally, but also the controls and, the belts and braces around how people use AI internally, because I think we'll probably come back to that. There's a garbage in, garbage out piece that kind of predates AI, but has always been fundamental for me as a finance person, that a computer will still only do what you tell it to do according to the logic you told it to do it in, even if it's learning. And so if that logic is false or the data that's going in is false, bizarre things could come out and people could believe those. And then, any number of terrible things could happen. So I think that's the thing that we all have to guard against. And I think we're all just learning as humans. We're really at the very early stages of this.
Yeah, no, quite right. I mean, I think we've seen, speaking about the deep fakes, there was I think we shared it actually in a previous webinar, one of those fraud attempts where, in fact, in Hong Kong, it was quite public. Somebody deepfaked the CFO and the board of directors, instructing one of the investment officers to hand over, I think it was in the tune of about $25 million. And she went ahead and processed the whole transaction because, the boss was telling her to do it on a video call. I mean, that's very much on the extreme, but of course, you don't even have to be half as sophisticated as that, as we're finding out to commit some of these things. But, that's certainly where it does seem to be going.
And I just can't resist from sharing. I mean, this is again going back to, you always have to have critical thinking and analytical skills. I remember my first week in Woodside that somebody did sort of a clone of my email address and sent it to my financial controller and told them to wire $50 million somewhere. And the person came racing into my office going, I'm working on it right now. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. And when we looked at it, we realized it was a fake email. But then, any finance person will know there are controls around cash processing that would never allow you to just process something because someone said. And so it's just realizing that now there are these additional, which I would just call cybersecurity risk out there, that people still have to use segregation of duties and honor work process, et cetera, and just be on extra alert now that these extra threats are out there.
I think you're right. I think that it still comes down to the basics of those things. So I think you mentioned a bit about sort of talking about your team and sort of how that impacts, people who work in the different functions of finance, and of course there are many different things there. So what do you see the impact being on them, maybe at the early stages, and how you work with that? But
maybe before we go there, if I could, I kind of want to back up a second because I said I'd get to it. But we had talked about kind of where do you start on all this? And I
Yes.
think for
Yeah.
me, this predates AI, but if I think about every company I've ever worked in, and again, I assume that this will resonate with many, if not all on the call, you can't apply technology over junk. And what I mean is there's sort of two pieces of that have always been an Achilles heel everywhere I've worked. And you know, if you neglect it, it gets even worse. And one of them is master data. And one of them is just looking at, you know, old school, what are your end-to-end processes and, you know, what goes in and what comes out. And they work together, right? Because you've got data and it goes through a process and then it becomes something that then can be interpreted and that you can make decisions on. And, you know, I remember in one company that will remain unnamed, I was in this task force and it was just mind numbing because 2 years of monthly meetings discussing what is the definition of master data, and we still hadn't agreed. Now you can imagine like how much progress can you make as a company if you can't even agree what your master data is, and then you don't know how to put it through your processes. So I think there's no way to get around that. It's not sexy. No one wants to do it, but if you don't do it, don't bother with trying to lay technology over the top of it, because junk on top of junk just creates more fancy junk.
Yes.
And a warning I would give as well, particularly me having worked in mid caps and large caps, often the answer is not to just say, I'll just outsource everything and let, you know, one of these third-party services do it. Because if you outsource junk, it's probably going to become even more junky. And then you're going to have frustrated people, shadow organizations internally. And again, no point to try to layer AI over the top of that. So I think the tool that I have always learned to use, and I learned this in Shell, but the acronym is universal, is to try to really think as a CFO and as a finance team around, it's called ESSA, and it stands for elimination, standardization, simplification, and then finally automation, which is where, you know, I saw a lot of people had the focus on this today. So you got to really step back to everything and saying, how can you make a work process as simple as possible? How can you make master data as simple as possible? Do you need all that? Could you simplify or eliminate any of that? And then ultimately, when you're down to what you need, which again should link back to the business strategy or purpose, then you say, okay, what do I automate? Yes. And then how do I automate it? Do I need AI, or is it something more cheap and cheerful? And you know, what is going to be the best bang for my buck, given that you always have to justify this stuff from a cost perspective. It's not like anybody out there has an unlimited IT budget. I'm sure that will resonate with folks as well. You know, where are you going to put those dollars to where they really count, and only on that small kernel of really business critical data that is good data and not junk. Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah,
it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think that's very much the world that we live in at Satori, where we've been asked to do all these sort of wonderful things with people's data, but ultimately when we come back to it, it's the fundamentals of master data and just cleanliness and integrity of that information that has to be there before you can do anything with it, let alone AI, which of course we're looking at as well. But it's not particularly sexy, and it's probably hard to convince many to invest heavily in that. But the reality is, without those foundations, it's almost a non-starter.
Yep. And people can, you know, again, it can be very seducing, if you like, because people can feel like, well, you know, I'm not going to worry about that because I don't have the budget. But just put these reports out because there's a dashboard that my leadership team wants to look at every month. But you can put that dashboard out. It looks beautiful. Yeah. But it's meaningless because it's not correct. Yeah. So, you know, substance over form is not good.
And probably that Excel spreadsheet is sitting behind it, putting in all that information.
Correct. The darn Excel.
Okay, that's great. So, I mean, I suppose we were interested to just understand also from people on the call around, you know, what kind of investment you're looking to make into AI, and is this something that has come onto your radar? So I'm going to launch another poll, which I'm hoping you can quickly answer for us. And that is, how much time and effort has your organization invested in looking at these opportunities around AI? Anything from none and don't plan to, through to already significant investments made. My expectation is probably somewhere in between for most organizations. But of course, there will be some that have really, and depending on the industry, I suppose, as well. You know, I'm talking about it in terms of the finance function as such, but in some industries, it's probably easier to do than others. Okay, I think I'll end it there and just quickly share the results. So yeah, I think it's suspected. There's a small minority, and none and don't plan to. That'll be quite interesting to know what sits behind that. And of course, those who've got a significant investment made, that's also would be quite interesting to understand. But I think that, yeah, anything from planning through to experimental type of effort is the majority. Any thoughts on that, Chair?
Interesting, because I think now I can come back to your question around what's the impact on your team, and I sort of touched on that at the beginning, that I think it's fundamentally changing the nature of work. I guess how I've thought about it as a CFO with budget constraints, as I also just mentioned, and how I will think about it as I now go into a new CFO role where technology reports to me, is that you really, again, have to think about what is the business case that is most strong for the AI that you select to do. And I'd argue there's not a company out there that can afford not to be doing AI. So yeah. I don't know who said none and don't plan to, but I just challenge you to go back and think about that again. But I'd also challenge, at the other end, that significant investment doesn't have to mean significant dollars or whatever currency it is that you're using. It could be significant investment in upskilling your people so that they can develop it themselves. Because often these days, I found it during COVID at Woodside, some people got a little bit stir crazy while they were locked down at home and decided to go do Power BI courses and figured out themselves how to build, some of the logic that they needed to take some of their reporting out of Excel. Now, there are a lot of things that are more fundamental, and some things do really require real hard investment. But I think the technology is racing ahead so quickly that it's actually probably more your people's time and your people's skills that need to be invested in. And that can be done by changing the way you work and improving the way you work such that your cost levels don't increase. And in fact, you still get the benefit that goes along with that. And I think that's always got to be the balance. Nobody's getting an unlimited checkbook for anything. And certainly as a CFO, I know my shareholders would be very angry about my overhead cost if I did. I probably wouldn't have a job for very long. But at the same time, they're not saying don't use technology or don't use AI. In fact, I think any company who doesn't want to use AI is probably quickly going to be obsolete. Because your competitors are, and they'll be racing ahead of you. So it's how do you actually balance those constraints and the opportunity that's around that?
And I think it also becomes inevitable that you will be using AI by virtue of the underlying technologies which you use already now, whether it's your ERPs or your analytics programs or whatever it is that you're currently using. They will be improved using AI, whether you've sort of consciously invested in those.
And I think it's, the mindset, and I certainly learned this from my children all the time, has got to be very different than what I was brought up with. When I graduated in, last century from university and had to handwrite out on my T accounts, to get my certified public accountant accreditation. That's not how kids do it these days. They're always doing the latest app. They've learned to do math in different ways, and it's changing all the time. And so I think there has to be a fundamental mindset for all of us, regardless of our vintage, that says, it's not scary for me to have to learn a new way to do my job, maybe every quarter or every year. It's actually fun. And it's like the latest app. And how cool do I want to be that I know how to use the latest app, because it just made my life easier and better and maybe more marketable, whether it's in my own company for promotion or if I decide I want to do something different. So it's changing again from that, kind of fear and resistance mindset to an embracing mindset, I think is the challenge for all of us in finance, regardless of your sector these days.
And that's quite right. And I noticed we have run a bit of a time. So those of you who've remained, thank you for staying with us. If there are any questions, maybe just put them in now. Any final thoughts? I have got one question that's come through. I can ask that.
Go for it. I think I've covered all my points.
Anything else? Somebody wrote, "Hi Sherry, do you believe that there's a direct correlation between investment in AI and increased productivity within the finance department and the organization as a whole?" So
just listening to that, I think it kind of builds on what I've just said, Mark, is that it depends on how you define investment. I think there's an exponential upside, but it's not necessarily how many dollars you spend to get a programmer to come in and do something for you. It's people building new skill sets, owning it, relating it to business, problems, and then I think there's exponential returns that can come with it. It's not linear at all.
I would certainly think so. Another question that came up is, do you think there's a risk with AI over time that fewer people with who are subject area experts, because it dumps down their expertise, their expert knowledge?
Again, I think that's been a fear that people have had. My view, coming from a background of accounting, applied finance, is that becomes even more important to know my skill set and to understand the principles underneath it, because it's pretty easy to kind of keep that front of mind when you're doing the T accounts with your pencil yourself, like I did, in the last century. But you still have to know accounting principles to be a good accountant. You still have to know, financial skills if you're going to think about valuing shares and looking at, how shareholders look at your company. And in fact, it even makes it more important that you keep that, like I said, front of mind when the computer's doing a lot of the calculations. If you dumb it down, you've given over the intelligence to the AI. And I think that's the risk we've talked about that you must most avoid, in the conversation today.
Yeah. And one last question, and I think we'll end off there. Is there a chance that AI can support cybercrime? So I'm assuming that means, can cyber criminals use AI? And we spoke about, obviously, that we've, like I spoke about deep fakes, and that's we see that. But
I think
I
think Donald Trump is a convicted criminal, so I think there's evidence of that. But joking aside, I mean, look, the reality is cyber criminals are using it all the time today, and have been for quite some time, and that's why cybersecurity is one of the biggest single risks that organizations are facing. But I don't think it should stop us from realizing all the wonderful opportunities we just got to, like we've talked to throughout today. Think about those downsides and mitigate against them.
Yeah, and I suppose on the other front, having AI in your corner to be able to combat cybercrime and learn from what's the various scams and phishing techniques and all of that are out there, means that the AI can actually learn how to combat those things better as well. So,
and that's probably a great closing statement. You got to fight fire with fire from that perspective. But I think that good guys and girls win. So I think the good AI certainly should have the opportunity, and we've got to seize that to outdo the bad and have some remarkable advancement that we can achieve with that as we go forward.
No, that's great. That's great, Sherry. Thanks so much again. Really appreciate you coming in and giving us of your time. I know that from Monday that will be probably less likely, so we grabbed it in a good time. Thanks everybody for joining us. As I mentioned, we will send you a recording of this. Any other questions that you want to put to us or to Sherry, just feel free to reach out, and we'll be in contact with our next webinar in the next few weeks.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.